Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the inspiring comments from the Governor. I am thrilled to be here with such an eminent group this morning to discuss the critical topic of physical climate change and the role of businesses and financial markets in addressing that physical risk. I'll start with one question, which is what happens in businesses and financial markets when today no longer looks like tomorrow? This may seem obvious, but bear with me. For our entire civilization, how we build our infrastructure, how we feed ourselves, how we do our jobs, all rely on a stable climate, where today does look like tomorrow. But it wasn't always that way. And at McKinsey, we like data, and here is 300,000 years of it. And as we look back at CO2 and temperature levels over the years, during the Pleistocene period, the climate never stabilized. So humans kept moving on. They were nomads. And then 10,000 years ago, something changed, and humans settled. They built houses, they built cities, they created capital, they created surplus, they invested. And why did they do that? Well, they did that because the climate had stabilized. Today, CO2 levels are at 415 parts per million, which is higher than any level we've seen in the last 3 million years, and they're projected to go a lot higher. So what happens in specific local areas of the world and specific groups of people when tomorrow doesn't look like today, when the ice melts and the climate changes? Well, at McKinsey, we've been trying to translate the physical impacts of climate change, like drought, heat, inundation, storms, to socioeconomic impacts. These are impacts that impact people. So, for example, real asset destruction, infrastructure, services, workability and livability thresholds, yields on crops. And you're all familiar with the data today, but I think the important thing about this is climate ends up being a multiplier on the probability of those events happening. We also know that the impacts of climate change, the physical impacts, are spread very unevenly. Temperatures over the last 100 years or so have increased in some places by up to 5 degrees. So when we compare that to the 1 degree average, you see, if you like, the tyranny of averages. Averages in some cases just aren't that helpful. So looking into the future, where is the risk going to be? Well, climate models help because they can forecast what will happen in the future. And we've been looking at socioeconomic systems around the world where some of the assumptions that people take as a given may suddenly start to look brittle when you add in the vector of climate change. So let's have a look at one or two of these. India. Will India get rich before it gets too hot? Now, the world assumes that India will have robust growth, and in fact, many companies are betting on it. But what happens when we add in climate change? It's important to remember that India today is already one of the most hot and humid places on Earth, and 75% of the labor force, or about 380 million people, rely on working outdoors, and only 7% of households have an air conditioning unit. So as the Earth warms, we will start to see physiological thresholds being crossed. So when they are crossed, what happens, for example, to workability? How many hours of working outdoors will be lost? What happens to human lives, and how will they be at risk, and if so, where? What will all this mean for the Indian economy and its people? Another example, how robust are coastal areas once mortgage lenders, insurers, and government agencies understand their full exposure? Florida, for example, is exposed to acute events like hurricanes, but also chronic events like tidal flooding. Now today, beachfront property continues to be seen as an attractive investment, but at some point, when will long-term lenders see it for what it might be, which is to have some risk? And we may see these economic impacts long before we see the physical impacts, because lending and the buying and selling of homes rely on expectations of the future. And this is an important concept. For financial markets, once they have the visibility of what will happen, effectively pull forward the impacts of tomorrow's climate change to today. Indeed, once they see it, they have a fiduciary responsibility to address it. There are several other examples here that we're working on right now, and we will be publishing these in the next few months. But I want to spend just a couple minutes on Europe. This is some data from the Woods Hole Research Center, and it looks at how many times parts of Europe and North Africa experienced rolling 3-month droughts in a decade between 1951 and 1980. What is important to see here is that light shade of orange covering most of Europe indicates that less than 10% of a given decade during that period was spent in drought conditions. But let's wind the clock forward. And you see Europe and North Africa in a sea of this red color, which means that in a given decade, by 2040, up to 75% of that decade would be spent in drought. Let's just look at that again, because it is quite shocking. From essentially no drought to a state of almost permanent drought in Portugal, Spain, southern France, Italy, Turkey, Greece. So what are the socioeconomic impacts of that? And here are some of the questions that we've started looking at. So what, for example, so I'll just go back to that. What, for example, will be the impact on tourism? What will be the impact on Europe's agriculture? What will be the impact on relocation of people, assets, and operations in and around the region? And importantly, are Europe's institutions ready? Possibly not. So this begs the question, who is at risk? And clearly, anyone connected to location is at risk. Anyone connected to duration through long-term assets is at risk. But in a global connected economy, who else is at risk? Well, the answer is probably everyone. And so I've been working in sustainability now for almost 2 decades, and I've realized that what we need here is not doing more of the same, but actually a fundamental paradigm shift in managing climate risk. So I'll just mention the three areas. Here's what we need to do. Embedding climate risk in every decision we have. Climate risk cannot be an overlay. 2, adapting. The world will now likely heat for decades. We have to face that head on. And 3, aggressively decarbonize. This is urgent. So let's take each briefly in turn. So first of all, embedding climate risk is going to require new tools, new metrics to diagnose the risk and also to perform scenario analyses on possible futures. Importantly, we can't just rely on historic precedent, and we need climate science forecasts and probabilities. One interesting example, consider the trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. Will lean supply chains, for example, in the future be considered as an asset or a climate liability? Preparing for this near-term change also requires recognizing that the temperature changes in the next decade are effectively locked in. So how do we deal with that? Well, there are a range of adaptation tools, from physical hardening like seawalls to using insurance, reinsurance, and public partnerships to transferring risk like we are seeing with flood re in the UK. This will require trillions of dollars and also hard choices like where to harden existing assets versus reduce exposure and retreat. And we will also need, critically, to support vulnerable areas, including the risk of capital flight. And lastly, decarbonization. Well, the math is simple. We have 500 to 600 gigatons in the carbon budget to stay within 1.5 degrees, and at 40 gigatons a year and rising of emissions, that doesn't leave us much time, and global installed bases will need many decades to make an orderly transition. And it's critical to remember that we cannot adapt our way out of this indefinitely. We must do both. Decarbonization, well, we know there are waves of activity going on across sectors. This is some of what we're seeing, talking to the companies that we serve, and this gives you an indication of which industries are moving. The bottom line is everyone is doing something, but the progress is not sufficient to realize those mitigation targets. But each industry does actually have a viable path to get there. So let's put it all together. And here's what I'd like to leave you with. Here's what we need to get done. We need lots of technology. Fortunately, the range of technologies is broad and will keep increasing, and we believe innovation will continue to deliver. We also need regulation to help direct market forces and solve equity issues. And lastly, we need a lot of capital. And we focus this discussion on capital flows because today, in specific regions, capital continues to flow into risky assets, further promoting risky behavior. But showing businesses and financial markets the specific nature of the risks ahead may enable them to do what they do best, which is redirect capital to the right places. So let me end this with the good news. Firstly, we have a good forecast. We can say with spatial and socioeconomic precision how things will change. Secondly, we know that financial markets, when they better understand the specific socioeconomic risks, will likely act. Thirdly, we know what needs to be done, what technologies to invest in, what rules need to be changed, how to adapt, and how to mitigate. And we know it is urgent, that this week is decisive, that the next decade is decisive. The task is surely daunting, but it is also exciting. It is true that everyone must do something, but it is also true that everyone can do something. It is a risky time. It is a time that matters. It is a time for courageous leadership. Thank you.